Hi, welcome to Fostering Resilience. I'm KJ Foster. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing part one of a four-part series on compassion. I'm going to be launching each part of the four parts, one video at a time, and then I'm going to be adding them all together so that you can watch them either individually or all together if you choose. So depending upon when you're watching this video, they may or may not already be uploaded to my channel. If they are, you will find links in the description. So whether you think that you know about compassion or you don't know about compassion, I hope that you find something in this video to be beneficial and to help you perhaps expand upon your knowledge of compassion, and also just as a reminder to practice self-compassion and compassion towards others. So let's just go ahead and jump right into the material. Okay, so as I said, this series of presentations is all about helping you to understand compassion, what it is, what it's not, or to better understand compassion, because you may already have a general idea of what compassion is all about, but hopefully you'll gain some new knowledge or expand upon the knowledge that you already have. So as I shared, this is a four-part presentation. This initial video is focused on what is compassion. Then we're going to go into differentiating compassion from other constructs, the compassionate mind model, and how to shift from anger to compassion. So we start with what is compassion. Compassion has three core components: self-kindness versus self-judgment, common humanity versus isolation, mindfulness versus over-identification. And we're going to delve into each one of those components. But before we do that, I want to share that this information is based upon the research that has been conducted by a woman named Kristin Neff. And you can find lots of additional information about compassion on her website, which I share in the description. So you can go ahead after you watch this video and click on that and learn a lot of additional information, purchase her books if that's something that you'd like to do. But these core components are based upon her research. So when we talk about compassion in general, we're talking about compassion towards others. Kristin Neff focuses specifically on self-compassion. So that's when we are offering compassion to ourselves versus offering compassion to other people. Regardless, compassion still embodies these three core components. So let's look at each one of these. So self-kindness versus self-judgment, or kindness towards others versus judgment towards others. So this is basically treating others and ourselves with kindness, care, understanding, and support, just as we would treat a good friend. But most people don't do that, especially people who are struggling with substance use disorders, even the family members, because as someone who has experienced both, as someone who has experienced an addiction and as someone who has had a family member, in particular, a son who has struggled with addiction, this was true, in beating myself up about my own addiction, and then beating myself up about my role in my son's addiction. The things that the shoulds, right? We should on ourselves. Oh, I could have, should have, would have, if I had only. Those types of, a lot of family members have those feelings, whether it's a child, whether it's a spouse, whether it's, a friend for that matter. So most people treat themselves much more harshly and say cruel things to themselves that they would never say to others, right? So if only people could hear the way that we talk to ourselves within our own mind, they would probably be pretty shocked. And I think that there are a lot of people out there, myself included, that will present at a certain way, right? We'll wear the mask of everything's great, everything's fine, I'm wonderful, but inside our own heads, we're beating ourselves up. So compassion includes also, in addition to treating ourselves with kindness, with care, with understanding, and others as well, compassion includes the wish and effort to alleviate suffering. Suffering is one of the core components of compassion, that is not a part of any other similar construct like sympathy, empathy, and we're going to go into that in detail in the next presentation. But compassion includes this component of suffering, recognizing that we are experiencing suffering, that I am in a moment of suffering, being able to recognize and acknowledge the suffering of someone else. So this is especially critical when it comes to family members and friends of individuals who are recovering from a substance use disorder, because there's not that component of empathy, right? For most family members, unless you're someone like myself who has experienced both, you don't get it, right? You think to yourself, well, God, I don't understand why my loved one can't just stop. They totally don't understand. So there's not that ability to empathize, which is the Me Too experience, right? And that's understandable. If I've never experienced a migraine, let's just say, it's going to be pretty hard for me to really identify with the pain and suffering of someone who experiences migraines on a regular basis. And yet, as a family member, even though we can't experience that really powerful empathy, we can offer compassion, which means we can identify that our loved one is experiencing suffering as a result of their addiction. They're not doing it on purpose. They're not doing it to hurt us, even though sometimes it feels that way. That's really not the truth. So we can learn how to be compassionate, how to treat our loved ones with kindness, care, and understanding, which will actually contribute to their recovery rather than their relapse. When we treat people who are suffering from substance use disorders with condemnation and judgment and criticism, that only serves to fuel the addiction and make it stronger. So that's a really important component to understand. And so, as I said, and as you can see here on the screen, compassion includes this wish and this effort to alleviate suffering. And there's an action component to self-compassion and compassion for that matter. It involves actively comforting, protecting, and supporting ourselves when we're in pain. So that's even can be, it can be helpful just to simply acknowledge that this is a moment of suffering. So whether it's you get a phone call that's distressing, you have a conversation with a loved one or a friend or a colleague that is distressing to you, you can actually acknowledge within your own mind or privately out loud if you go, and take care of yourself, which is the recommendation. If you've watched my healthy communication presentation, you know that when we're in this moment of suffering, when we're in conflict with someone and we're becoming emotionally escalated, the best thing to do is to go and take a break and focus on some deep breathing and maybe even tapping, which I have a video that's all about tapping in terms of alleviating anxiety, which I just recently posted. So taking care of yourself, comforting yourself, protecting and supporting yourself, because the truth is, until we learn how to be self-compassionate and do that for ourselves, we're really not able to be compassionate towards others. We can try, and people often do. There are many people experiencing codependency who go out and are doing for others and are attempting to help and be compassionate towards others. But if you're not first doing that for yourself and toward yourself, there's going to be a disconnect that happens, and you're ultimately not going to be able to be at peace or to be happy. So the next component, so we're going from loving kindness, right? Practicing loving kindness towards ourselves and then practicing loving kindness towards others. There's this common humanity component, common humanity versus isolation. So seeing our imperfections as part of the larger human experience, also recognizing that everyone experiences suffering. I am not alone in this. When we struggle or fail, we often feel that something has gone wrong, that this shouldn't be happening, and this creates a feeling of abnormality. I am wrong, leading to shame and isolation, wanting to withdraw. And this is common for for anyone and everyone, but especially for people who are struggling with a substance use disorder and their family members, there's a lot of shame that is associated with that. And the higher the levels of shame, the higher risk for relapse. And so the common humanity recognizes that I'm not the only one that has experienced a substance use disorder. And for family members, it's I am not the only family member that is experiencing the suffering that I'm experiencing, which then is why it's so powerful to participate in some form of a support group for family members as well. So it's really powerful for the individual who's recovering from the substance use disorder, but it's also recommended and highly beneficial for the family member, because then you're able to really experience and see and understand this common humanity piece, and surround yourself with people who are experiencing or have experienced what you're experiencing and have recovered from that experience. And now moving on to the third core component of compassion, and that is mindful awareness. So mindfulness versus over-identification, knowing that we are suffering while we suffer, right? So when we're in that moment of suffering, like I said, being able to acknowledge to yourself, this is a moment of suffering that I'm in. And this is a prerequisite for compassion to arise. So we have to really first be mindful of the fact that we are in a moment of suffering, or be mindful of the fact that we have a loved one that is in a moment of suffering, or in an experience that creates that comes with a significant amount of suffering, which substance use disorders do, absolutely. So mindfulness allows us to turn toward rather than turn away. So we're turning toward those painful feelings, and we're learning how to be with them as they are. And when we do that, we are able to actually reduce that experience of suffering. So mindfulness is a balanced state of awareness. We don't suppress, right? This isn't about suppressing or avoiding. It's the exact opposite. It's not suppressing or avoiding what we're feeling, and nor are we carried away by the dramatic storyline, which can happen, right? Which is very common. It's that going into this, poor me, oh my goodness, this is the most horrible thing in the world. We over dramatize our situation or our loved one's situation. And this process is referred to as over-identification. So we don't want to over-identify. We want to be mindful, and then learn through mindfulness practice how to be with those feelings, rather than allowing them to have their way with us, so to speak, right? To carry us into this over dramatization, this over identification. So again, three core components of compassion. So these three core components may be lyrically rephrased, and I love this. So if you take loving kindness, right? So loving self-kindness in particular, and then you take the common humanity, which is all about being connected to others, and then presence, right? That mindfulness, that mindful awareness is all about learning how to be with your feelings in the present moment. It can be rephrased lyrically to loving, connected presence. And if you are someone who considers yourself to be spiritual, even though everyone has a spiritual component within them, I think you will really appreciate the true meaning of this, right? When you look at this and you think about it, this loving, connected presence. Because self-compassion, the practice of self-compassion and being compassionate towards others, gives us strength. It's one of those spiritual principles that when we practice this, that it continues to produce strength within our bodies. And I have another presentation that talks all about spirituality and behavioral kinesiology, and how spiritual practice really serves to strengthen our spirit, strengthen our mind, our body, and our souls. So you can go ahead and jump on over to my channel and check out that video if you wish. So here are some misgivings and misperceptions about self-compassion, which is similar to spiritual principle of forgiveness, right? People have a tendency to think of forgiveness as a weakness. Many people think of compassion as a weakness when we are compassionate towards others or we are compassionate towards ourselves. And that is so far from the truth, because again, these spiritual principles and practicing them actually create strength within the body. So some misperceptions are that self-compassion is a form of self-pity. If I'm compassionate toward myself, I am, treating myself with pity. And in the next presentation, you will learn the difference between compassion and these other constructs, such as pity. So it is not a form of self-pity. It is not a weakness, as I just explained. It is not selfish. Think about putting the oxygen mask on yourself when you're on an airplane before you're able to help anyone else. I think that is a perfect metaphor for how important spiritual principles like self-compassion and self-forgiveness are. Not selfish, not self-indulgent. It's not a form of making excuses, and it will not undermine motivation. Like I said, it actually will give your mind, body, and spirit more strength. All right, so that concludes part one of my 4-part series on compassion, and just a few points that I would like to emphasize as potential takeaways. And number one is how important it is to practice self-compassion before we're ever really able to be effective at offering compassion to others. And what I share with people, which I believe to be so true, is that the relationships we have with others, are the health of the relationship we have with other people is a direct reflection of the health of the relationship we have with self. And as we are able to build that healthy relationship with self, we are better able to develop healthy, loving relationships with others. And when you are in active addiction, when you are in early recovery, you have a very unhealthy, abusive relationship with self. And then the other point that I'd like to emphasize is that even though family members cannot experience empathy with their loved one who is experiencing the substance use disorder, nor for that matter is it possible sometimes for the person experiencing the substance use disorder to experience empathy with their loved one, because there's a disconnect. The loved one doesn't get why their loved one is acting the way they're acting, and that's for a variety of different reasons, mostly associated with not being educated about how substance use disorders affect the brain, and that their loved one is not doing this on purpose or to hurt them, or all of these other misconceptions that we have about addiction. And also vice versa, the person who is actively using substances or in the early recovery process, their mind has been so impacted by the substance use that it's difficult, if not impossible, for them to really understand the impact that they're having on their loved one. Although many do, it's you can't really have that me too experience, but you can learn how to offer compassion. And that doesn't mean, I know family members get very sensitive about this, because then the family member may interpret, well, does that mean that I have to accept certain behavior? Does that mean I have to be kind? And we can always be respectful in the way in which we communicate things. And I think that for family, if you are a family member, going and checking out my healthy communication video, it talks about how important it is to say what we mean, but not say it mean, and not to convey that contempt, that really dangerous and destructive contempt, and the judgment, being able to learn how to offer that compassion rather than the judgment is really going to help support your loved one's success in their recovery. And also, if you're the individual yourself, really practicing being loving and kind towards yourself, because then you're going to be able to better extend that to your loved ones as well. So those are a couple of the points that I really would like to emphasize about compassion before we move on to part two.
So moving on from part one, where we talked about what is compassion, to part two, differentiating compassion from other constructs that are often confused with compassion. And one of the most common is empathy. Actually, empathy and sympathy are most often confused with compassion because they're thought to be associated with helping. However, unlike compassion, empathy does not incorporate a readiness to act in order to relieve the suffering of others. Rather, it's the ability to understand another's feelings and become one with that person's distress. So it's the Me Too experience. Empathy is the capacity to be affected by and share the emotional state of another and identify with the other, adopting even his or her perspective. Empathy in and of itself is a very powerful experience. It's what we experience when we participate in a support group meeting. So whether that you're the individual recovering from a substance use disorder or any other addiction or even illness, there are support groups for grief, there are support groups for cancer survivors, there are support groups for divorced individuals, just about any issue that you can think of, there's a support group out there for it. And one of the reasons why that is so is because of this powerful empathy experience where we can go and receive support from people who have experienced the same thing, that Me Too, that very powerful Me Too experience. So for family members, it's very helpful to be able to go and have your own support group of people who are experiencing the same thing that you've experienced. And even more beneficial is the fact that you're going to meet people who have recovered from the experience that you are experiencing. So really, this is just about understanding the differences between these concepts, because empathy is something that family members can experience with other family members, with other individuals who have gone through the same thing. So you're able to share that emotional state. You're able to identify with that other person. But again, family members often are not able to identify with their loved ones who are experiencing the addiction. So there's not that empathy that is there, but there is the ability to offer compassion. And that's really the bottom line that I'm trying to convey by comparing these different constructs, is that so you really fully understand the benefit, the power, the importance of compassion when it comes to recovering from a substance use disorder or any addiction or codependency or anything like that, that you're able to offer yourself compassion first and then be able to focus on offering compassion to those that you love and care about. So now moving on to sympathy. Sympathy, it similarly is the feeling of care and concern for someone, which is often accompanied by a wish to see them happier. So there may be that desire to act based upon that feeling of sympathy. Just think about anyone who you know who has experienced a loss, and there's often that desire to comfort them, or there's a desire to send a card or to send flowers or to do something to help to alleviate that person's suffering. Sympathy is the experience of feeling sorrow for someone else's misfortune, but not necessarily a shared perspective or shared emotions. For example, let's use the case of a family member or even the individual who's recovering from a substance use disorder. I may experience a feeling of sorrow for their misfortune or for the illness or for the suffering, but if I don't have someone that I know who is experiencing a substance use disorder, family member, friend, or otherwise, even though that's very rare, I definitely believe that if you really look hard enough and think about it, that every single person I know, most people, let's just say a majority of people know someone, whether that's a family member, a friend, a coworker, or know of someone who is struggling with a substance use disorder or recovering from a substance use disorder. But that aside, right? That aside, we may not necessarily share the perspective or the emotion, right? If we don't know someone who is recovering or don't have a family member or haven't experienced it ourselves. With compassion, on the other hand, there is recognition of the other person's emotional state and a desire to act in order to help. So I can feel sympathy for someone, but that doesn't necessarily always come with a desire to act. With compassion, there is that desire to act in order to help. Moving on to pity, my least favorite, and I think probably everyone's least favorite. Pity is, though, commonly confused with compassion. And there have been a lot of definitions that I've read out there that include the word pity. And pity is not at all the same as compassion. They are two very different concepts. And pity is probably the one thing out of all of them that is the most detrimental, is the most damaging when it comes to recovering from a substance use disorder, because pity refers to more of a feeling of concern for someone thought to be inferior or weaker than oneself. And although when a person is experiencing a substance use disorder and they are in early recovery from that substance use disorder, are they in a weakened state mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually? Yes. But this is more about a sense of superiority or better than, right? So looking at that person who has a substance use disorder as being inferior, or you being superior in some way, or even looking at family members who have someone who is struggling with a substance use disorder as inferior. I remember being told by certain individuals that it was my fault, and if I had been a better parent and I was an inferior parent, and, all these judgments that people who have not been through what I have been through have no idea what they're talking about. And so this pity, this, oh, you poor thing, that way in which people view people who struggle with substance use disorders as, bad, immoral, inferior. Pity, I think, can often really translate into contempt in some circumstances as well. And no one, I don't care who you are, no one likes to be pitied. It is not a good feeling. So again, pity is not helpful when it comes to substance use disorders at all. Compassion, on the other hand, does not consider the person who is suffering or the object of suffering to be weak or inferior in any way. Instead, it encourages a broader version through common experiences. And this is where we focus on substance use disorders as an illness, which is what they are, an illness that has impacted the brain, a brain disease, and not treating people who are experiencing this with pity or with contempt, which again will just feed the illness, feed the addiction, and make it stronger and make it worse for the individual. So the more that people can understand this and start to shift the way that they treat individuals who are suffering, because they are, then we are able to make steps towards more people being able to fully recover. So clearly, I'm very passionate about this. I'm sure you can hear it in my voice, because I've been that person who has experienced that contempt, who has experienced that pity, being the individual and recovering, and myself, and as a family member. And so again, I just would like to get this information out and share it with as many people as possible so that more people can understand how compassion is really the key for successful recovery and in terms of treating individuals with compassion rather than pity, judgment, contempt, and all of these other negative attitudes and emotions. And so moving on to altruism, my husband likes to say that there is no such thing as true altruism, because what is altruism? Altruism is acting out of concern for another person's well-being. It's about giving, right? It's about, I want to help, I want to give. And even though we can do that without expecting anything in return, we actually gain a benefit, a natural benefit of altruism by the positive feelings that we get. So that's why there's really no true altruism, because we do receive that very powerful and positive, good feeling for helping someone else, especially without having the expectation of receiving anything in return, which is really by definition what altruism is. While compassion encapsulates an openness to experiencing suffering and responding with genuine concern and without judgment. And so compassion, one of the things that I think is helpful in really understanding the main difference between compassion and all of these other constructs, is that compassion has that element of suffering, right? Of that there is acknowledgement that this individual is suffering and responding to that suffering with genuine concern and not judgment, not pity, not condemnation. And it's also worth noting that compassion can exist in the absence of altruistic behavior. So you can have a desire to reach out and help and alleviate that suffering, but it doesn't necessarily have to encompass anything where you are personally giving something of yourself. Let's just use prayer as an example. So for those who don't believe in prayer, then just go ahead and put this aside. But regardless of, religious belief or not, I think many people understand the power of prayer, that just praying for someone that you know is suffering is a compassionate act, because that puts positivity out into the universe in and of itself. And so that truly has the power to help individuals. So it's not like, this is where sometimes compassion can get confused with codependency. People think that they're helping when they're actually hurting. They think they're being compassionate when they're actually being codependent. Okay, so moving on to love and the difference between love and compassion. And this can be a little muddy, this one. This can be difficult to explain. And I think that really the key difference here is the experience of suffering and being open to that experience of suffering. Because clearly, especially when it comes to unconditional love, I let's use the example of the people that I love the most, which are my parents, my children, my husband. Those are individuals where I have unconditional love for them. I don't always feel positive towards them because, they'll do things or they'll say things that upset me, and I'll experience negative emotions like we all do, right? We all experience positive and negative emotions, even when but we're not really feeling very loving towards those individuals. At least I'm not, in the time that I'm experiencing my own suffering. So love is generally associated with positive affect and positive experiences. Compassion, on the other hand, like I said, is about being open to that experience of suffering, being able to recognize when I am angry and upset with things that my loved ones have said or that they have done, that I can offer myself compassion. I can be in that moment of acknowledging my own suffering and choosing to give myself compassion. But I can't necessarily, right? I can get to that place of being compassionate towards my loved ones, but not necessarily about that particular situation, right? Until I think this is a good example of how We have to offer compassion towards ourselves before we can ever really truly offer compassion to others. So I think this is a good example of that. I really need to acknowledge my own suffering and offer myself compassion before I can get to a place of forgiveness, right? And then potentially being compassionate towards my loved ones. But I won't necessarily be compassionate, but hopefully that makes sense in terms of love. I can love them, still move forward with this unconditional love. I don't always have to be happy and feel that positive affect and have positive experiences 24/7 with my loved ones to continue to love them. But compassion is different because compassion is about the experience of suffering, acknowledging it within myself and acknowledging it within others. Hi, welcome to part 3 of my 4-part series on compassion. In this presentation, I'm sharing with you the compassionate mind model, the 6 characteristics of compassion. So I'd like to start by sharing with you some information on why some people are afraid to develop compassion. And these are essentially their myths, right? Because people are afraid that compassion, if they develop compassion, if they show compassion, if they offer compassion, then they are somehow weak. And that is absolutely not true. Actually, practicing compassion will make you stronger mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, even. Another reason why people fear developing compassion is because they believe that others will then take advantage of them. And again, this is a myth because the exact opposite is true. Because I'm not just talking about compassion towards others, we're talking about compassion towards self as well. So whenever we're offering compassion towards ourselves, as I've shared in the previous presentations, that is referred to as self-compassion. And the more that you are able to develop self-compassion, the more you are going to be able to then offer that compassion to others, and the stronger you will become. And then, of course, people fear that if they open themselves up to difficult emotions, that they will be overwhelmed. And a part of compassion, as I've shared in the previous videos, is mindful awareness. So in practicing mindfulness, in practicing kindness, and in recognizing that common humanity, we actually develop resilience. We become better able to handle difficult emotions rather than the opposite. So initially, compassion, the practice of compassion, is difficult. And sometimes those difficult emotions will actually become more difficult in the beginning before you actually develop the strength to be able to move through them more easily. And so that is a truth that I'd like to definitely share with you so that you understand that. And I often refer to the metaphor of the gym, whether we refer to that as the spiritual gym or the sobriety, the recovery gym. What we're doing when we practice compassion, when we practice these spiritual principles, it's like going to the gym. And when you haven't been to the gym in a long time and you go and you work out, what happens? You usually get sore, right? Your muscles hurt before they actually get stronger. So the same is true when we practice compassion. If we haven't practiced compassion ever, if we've, lived for years, the majority of our life being self-critical or even, critical towards others, then this ability to practice compassion will essentially produce some pain at first before you start to develop that strength. Nothing, however, that cannot be overcome. I think it's just a matter of expecting it and leaning into it and understanding that often for some people, it is more difficult initially, but if you stick with it, you absolutely will get stronger and you'll be better able to handle those difficult emotions. So why do people then buy into these myths? Why do they believe what they believe? Well, they believe what they believe because they don't understand compassion. They've never learned about compassion. Maybe they've even been told things as they were growing up in their family of origin, maybe from other individuals, that compassion is a sign of weakness, that forgiveness is a sign of weakness. And compassion is anything but a sign of weakness, right? Compassion requires actually strength. It requires courage, which is what? It's moving forward despite fear, despite not even maybe fully understanding. And compassion is directed toward helping ourselves and helping other people, ultimately. Compassion involves assertiveness and standing up for ourselves and for others and not allowing ourselves to be taken advantage of. Compassion gives us a way to work with our difficult emotions that can help them ultimately heal. It also allows us to work with our difficulties as they come up so that they don't build up and then we blow up in the case of anger. And quite often when someone is struggling with codependency issues, there's that stuffing of the emotions, there's that negating of the emotions, and then they build up and they build up, and then the person just explodes. And let's face it, difficult emotions are not fun, right? Nobody likes to experience difficult or painful emotions, but compassion gives us a way to be better able to handle those difficult emotions, to be in a position where we develop that strength and we are less likely to act out in ways that are unhealthy or that will ultimately hurt us or create weakness within our bodies. So let's dive in to the 6 characteristics of compassion. Number 1, motivation. So a part of compassion is being motivated, having the desire to relate to ourselves and others in a kinder, more helpful way that will help ultimately alleviate suffering, alleviate our own suffering, and alleviate the suffering of others. So I give you examples of both compassion towards self and compassion towards others. So an example would be, I've suffered enough as a result of my anger. It's time to do something about it. This is not the sort of person I want to be. Or I may not be able to cure his or her addiction, but at least I won't contribute to it on purpose. I want to make things better for him or her, not worse. Number 2, sensitivity. We learn to notice difficult emotions and thoughts as they arise, just as they are in ourselves and others. This is where mindful awareness really helps with our ability to be sensitive, sensitive towards self. Look, I'm really getting irritated right now. Or in the case of someone else, look, I'm noticing their buttons are really getting pushed right now. And I know what that feels like because I've experienced it myself. So I'm being sensitive to my own feelings and to the feelings that are occurring within others. Number 3, sympathy. Now, in the last presentation, I shared with you the difference between sympathy and some other constructs relative to compassion, but sympathy is a component in and of itself of compassion. So we allow ourselves to be emotionally touched and moved by the suffering of ourselves and other people. So rather than denying our own difficulties, we allow ourselves to connect with how difficult this really is. So we are experiencing sympathy toward ourselves. So sympathy is recognizing and even articulating that when appropriate towards others. For example, as you see here, when I'm angry, I may look like the bad guy, but it isn't fun for me either. In fact, it hurts a great deal. So being able to communicate that to a loved one, even just saying something to yourself, such as this is a moment of suffering that I'm experiencing right now, and having sympathy towards yourself. That's also the ability to have sympathy for others. So when others are angry or hostile, recognizing that it isn't fun for them either. They hurt just like I do, the common humanity piece. I can sympathize with what they are experiencing. I can sympathize with what I am experiencing. In particular, the suffering that exists. Again, key characteristic that differentiates compassion from any other construct is the element of suffering. Do people that experience a substance use disorder suffer? Absolutely. Do family members and friends suffer? Absolutely. Number 4, distress tolerance. In order to work with difficult emotions, we have to learn to tolerate them. We learn to become familiar with our feelings and to accept and experience them rather than trying to push them away or trying to deny them. Changing angry habits means accepting and enduring the discomfort that occurs when we refrain from what we usually do. It's like having poison ivy, feeling the discomfort of an itch, but deciding not to scratch it because we know that scratching is only going to make it worse. And this is difficult, but we can do it. And it gets easier to do the more that we practice. So, examples, this is really uncomfortable and I really want to lash out or even escape, right? I want to act out and in an unhealthy way that's going to hurt me, that's going to hurt others. Let's see if I can do something different. I've endured difficult things in my life and I can endure this feeling. Because let's face it, when anyone chooses to pick up a drink or a jug, when they have reached the point where doing so has created unmanageability and pain in their life, they're choosing to do that based upon a feeling, generally a difficult feeling, or in some cases, it can be a positive. Some people relapse based upon a celebratory experience, right? Where they're feeling really good and happy and they're wanting to celebrate. But in the majority of the cases, I would say relapse is more likely to occur based upon a negative feeling. It's hard being around someone who's having a hard time, but I don't have to let their distress cause anger in me. We all struggle sometimes, and I wonder if there's something I can do to calm the situation. Practicing distress tolerance is one of the really critical components of the compassionate mind model, and it is the thing that is going to really help you to develop strength to move through those difficult emotions. Number 5, empathy. Here's another example of these other constructs that are coming in and supporting compassion practice. So empathy is learning to recognize and understand emotional experiences and how it makes sense that we or others may be feeling this way. We often think of empathy in relation to others, understanding and even identifying with how they are feeling, but it helps to understand our own feelings too, to be able to empathize, to be able to identify those feelings. We examine our own feelings with an accepting curiosity so that we can truly understand and work with them. Many of us never learn to recognize, name, and or talk about our emotions. And that can be based upon a variety of different experiences, whether that's growing up in an alcoholic family system, a rageaholic family system, basically a family system where it's not okay. You know, you learned it wasn't safe to talk about your feelings or to talk about your thoughts. So it became suppressed. Or you grew up in a very, supportive family of origin and you grew up being able to discuss these things, but then entered into a relationship when you became an adult that then created that environment where it was unsafe and you needed to then suppress how you were feeling or what you're thinking. And so then it becomes difficult, right? It becomes difficult to recognize, name, and talk about how we're feeling. So the empathy towards self is the awareness. I'm aware that I'm feeling angry, frustrated, maybe even embarrassed right now. And I'm also feeling like I don't really matter right now, or I don't feel very important or valued. And then there's the empathy toward someone else. Oh, she's really upset right now. I wonder if I can understand how it makes sense that she might feel this way, or identify that, yes, the Me Too experience, you know what? I get it. I've felt that way too. And then number 6, very critical component of compassion, is the non-condemning and non-judging. We learn to refrain from labeling our thoughts and feelings as good or bad, right or wrong. Our feelings are simply our feelings. We can observe our experiences and those of others without judging them. And we can be aware that our unwanted emotions are often part of our evolved threat response and not our fault. And this applies to everyone else too, right? So it makes sense that he or she feels like this right now and is acting this way, because we all have these difficult threat systems. We all have those responses to fear or feeling unsafe. And I want to make sure that I'm not doing things that make this person feel threatened, that make my loved one feel threatened. Or within self, it makes sense that I would feel this way right now. But I'm also aware that this feeling is a mental event. It's an experience in my brain, and it's neither good nor bad. It feels intense right now, but it will pass eventually. So this is especially important, critical part of compassion practice, this non-condemning and this non-judging, and something I really try to convey as much as possible to the individual and their family members or other loved ones, because condemning, judging, these are the things that fuel relapse. So the more that we are able to be non-condemning and non-judging towards ourselves, then the stronger we'll become and be able to better move through those difficult emotions that trigger relapse. Because let's face it, when it comes to any type of substance use disorder, whether that's a mild one, moderate, or in the case of addiction, we're talking about a severe substance use disorder, there is a lot of condemning and judging that comes along with that, which of course is what makes it such a challenging illness to overcome, but not impossible, which is a big part of why I do what I do, because I want to convey that and help people to understand that this is a very difficult illness to overcome, but it is not impossible. And learning these things like compassion, how to be compassionate towards self, how to be compassionate towards others, is going to help you to gain the strength that you need to overcome this illness and any other challenges and or issues that you may face. Hi, welcome to Fostering Resilience and part 4 of my 4-part series on compassion. In this video, I'm sharing with you how you can move from anger to compassion. And so let's go ahead, jump right in and get started. So to start, I would just like to point out that I think that this information is so incredibly relevant when it comes to substance use disorders, especially, but it's relevant to anybody and everybody because everyone experiences anger. Anger is one of those base human emotions, and so we can all benefit from learning how to go from this place of anger, how to shift out of anger into this place of more compassion. Yet, like I said, I do want to point out just the relevancy of how important this is for substance use disorders, because there is so much anger all across the board. There's anger from family members and other loved ones because of the negative behaviors that come with substance use disorders, that come with active addiction. But also don't lose sight of the fact that there's a lot of anger that is experienced by the person suffering from the illness themselves, right? There's a lot of self-hatred, self-loathing, guilt, shame that is often not articulated. And because it's not articulated, family members lose sight of the fact that it exists, right? They think maybe their loved one doesn't have any remorse, or they're not feeling guilty because they're not maybe articulating it. But let me tell you that I can guarantee that it's there. So keeping that in mind, that there's anger, and that anger is really being experienced by everyone involved. So we start with angry thinking versus compassionate thinking, remembering that our feelings are driven by our thoughts and vice versa, right? So it's all linked together. And in order to shift our minds from this angry, threat-driven thinking to more compassionate thinking, we can learn to identify specific thoughts that tend to drive the anger and to consider and generate more compassionate alternatives. So let's compare and contrast angry thinking versus compassionate thinking. So here we compare and contrast angry thinking versus compassionate thinking. So let's take each of these one by one. So with angry thinking, it's narrowly focused on the threat or the object of our anger. With compassionate thinking, it's not narrowly focused, it's more broad, and it considers many factors in attempting to understand the situation. Angry thinking is inflexible and it's ruminative, which means that we're just thinking about it over and over and over again. We're rehashing it in our minds over and over and over again, the thoughts that are driving that feeling of anger. Whereas compassionate thinking is much more flexible and focuses on problem solving rather than the problem itself. Angry thinking activates our threat system, whereas compassionate thinking activates our safe system. It helps us to feel comfortable and at peace rather than coming from this place of being threatened. Angry thinking directs hostility towards others and ourselves, whereas compassionate thinking directs kindness towards others and ourselves. Angry thinking is judgmental and it's critical, whereas compassionate thinking is non-critical and empathetic. Angry thinking focused on dominating or punishing. Compassionate thinking focused on helping ourselves and others and finding solutions that benefit everyone and harm no one. So here are some compassionate alternatives to angry thinking. First, consider the event that triggered your anger and then ask yourself, we're getting curious here. It's always beneficial to get curious when you're experiencing anger, especially anger that may be blown out of proportion or even out of context, but any anger that you're experiencing warrants curiosity. So consider the event that triggered your anger and ask yourself, how might I see this situation if I were not stressed or angry in this moment? Ask yourself, if there were a neutral, caring person around, how might they see this event and help me/us think it through? Ask yourself, how would I actually prefer to look at this if I were calm and collected? Ask yourself, how will I see this in 3 months from now? Will I even remember it? Ask yourself, from the perspective of your compassionate self, what might you say to a friend who experienced something similar? Or how would you attempt to help a friend to feel supported? Now, this is a writing exercise that I suggest that you do because I think that it will really help you to identify the things that are your triggers. So considering situations that have a tendency to cause you to feel angry, reflect on the thoughts that are fueling your anger about the situation, and then coming up with some compassionate alternative thoughts. So listing 5 angry thoughts, 5 thoughts that trigger that feeling of anger within you, and then listing 5 compassionate alternative thoughts. So go ahead and pause the video right now and go ahead and complete that. Okay, so now that you have completed that short exercise, let's now look at compassion in difficult situations, because the way we use compassionate behavior to deal with situations that trigger our anger can take many forms depending upon the situation. Sometimes in life, there are things we can do to effectively work with and change the situation that's provoking our anger. But at other times, we're faced with situations that we don't like, but we really can do little or nothing to change that situation or that person for that matter, right? So recognizing the situations that we can control and that we can change, and the ones that we cannot. I really love the Serenity Prayer that is a part, I think it comes from Al-Anon, and it goes like this. God, grant me the serenity to accept the people I cannot change, the courage to change the one I can, and the wisdom to know it's me. So let's focus on situations that we can have some effect on and things we can do to work on them. So let's look at compassionate thinking and emotion and consider a few things. Number one is to consider that you and everyone in this situation ultimately just wants to be happy and to avoid suffering, even though we can pursue this in very frustrating ways. And consider that everyone in this situation has a very complex brain. And for those who are suffering from addiction issues, that brain has been compromised. Consider that this is not your fault, and it's really not theirs either. So stopping the blame game is a huge step forward in the right direction and starting to focus on problem solving. Consider the situation and how you can cultivate empathy for them. Have you ever behaved like they're behaving? How are you feeling at that time? And how does their behavior make sense? So looking at each of these, maybe you've never behaved like they have behaved, but maybe you can identify with the feelings that that person is experiencing. Maybe you can look at how their behavior makes sense. Because again, when you're someone who is experiencing an addiction, especially a substance use disorder addiction, it creates cravings that then cause individuals to say and do things that they normally would not say and do had they not been under the influence. So how does this make sense? Again, sometimes it's very difficult to get to that place of empathy, but a part of compassion is starting to really think about and consider how you can identify with this person, with what they're doing, with how they're feeling, how their behavior makes sense based upon what they are or have experienced. Now, moving on to problem solving, compassionate thinking and behavior as a means of problem solving. So number one, consider the problem and generate potential solutions. So what are all the possible responses you could have to the situation? And something that I recommend too is writing down what your typical responses are to the situation and then coming up with alternate responses, because just having an alternate response, saying or doing something different in response to the situation, can create a different result. And using your compassionate mind to generate solutions, what does your compassionate self see as a good solution? Generate as many ideas as you can. They don't even have to be realistic. You can sift through, after you're done writing. A part of this is just writing as a means of processing your emotions. And the fact is that, solutions, whatever they are, they can involve both action and also acceptance. So they can involve action in things that we can possibly do, working with the situation, but they can also involve acceptance in that we're really working on our response to the situation, not really what we can do to change the situation, but how we can change our response to the situation. Number two, consider the consequences of various solutions. So using your compassionate mind, consider the solutions and their likely short-term and long-term consequences. If the situation involves other people, as most anger-producing situations do, there are various factors that can be considered in choosing the best response. So the objective, what outcome do I want from this situation? Sometimes just thinking about that, like what is my objective? What am I really trying to achieve with this response, with the way that I'm behaving? Because sometimes if you really think about your own behavior and the way that you're responding, it's pretty clear that that behavior is going to elicit a certain response in the other person. And then considering the relationship with the other people involved. How will your responses impact your relationship with this person? And then the expression of how you feel, letting others know how you're feeling about the situation, but with kindness rather than criticism and judgment. We may damage relationships in the service of our objectives by expressing emotions in hostile ways. So consider that others also respond from their threat system as well. So again, trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes and consider how they're likely to respond to how you are expressing how you're feeling about the situation. Number 3, using your compassionate mind to choose the best potential solution. So bringing to mind your compassionate self versus your angry self and select the solution that will work best for you and others who are involved in the situation. Choose an option that you will have the skills to carry out. One option can be asking for help from someone else who may be able to assist you. Number 4, implement and evaluate the solution. How did the situation turn out? What worked? What was helpful? What didn't work? When we're choosing compassionate alternatives and acting on them, we begin the process of establishing new compassionate brain patterns, new neural pathways in our brains. And this is uncomfortable stuff. Like, this is hard to do when we've had this established pattern of behavior, this established pattern of responding and reacting in a certain way towards a certain situation over and over and over again. This is why I think it is so critical to understand from a family perspective how just changing our response to a situation can initiate positive change. You know, I think it's Wayne Dyer who said, if I change the way I look at things, the things I look at change. And I think that you can apply that to, if I change the way I respond to things, the things I respond to can change. I totally believe that 100% because I've seen it happen in my life and the lives of others. So if we're going to help ourselves and others to change, we can do so in compassionate, helpful ways rather than in shameful, attacking ways that cause us to become trapped in shame, but don't really help us to do any better. Really, like I've said over and over again, shame only contributes to fueling addiction and making it that much stronger. So compassion is really the effective alternative, the effective antidote. So let's look at some shameful self-attacking and some compassionate self-correction. So shameful self-attacking comes from this desire to punish and condemn. It comes from this desire to blame too, right? Blame, punish, condemn. Whereas the compassionate self-correction comes from this desire to improve and to be at one's best. Shameful self-attacking is backward, right? It's backward focused. It's focused on the past, whereas compassionate self-correction is focused on the present moment and moving forward. Shameful self-attacking is linked to disappointment and focusing on deficits. Compassionate self-correction is linked to building on the positive and abilities. Shameful self-attacking is focused on emotions of anger, frustration, anxiety, and contempt, whereas compassionate self-correction is validation of setbacks and encouragement. Shameful self-attacking, consider a critical teacher with a child who is struggling, right? Consider a child who is struggling in school and you have this teacher that's being critical towards that child. And then consider the compassionate teacher, the teacher with a child who is struggling and them offering that child compassion. How will each of those scenarios play out differently? Okay, another writing exercise, this exercise for problem solving. So number one, you want to bring to mind a difficult situation in which you tend to get angry. Think about the various aspects of the situation. And it can help to use a when this happens, then that happens format. I think a good example when it comes to addiction in particular is when relapse happens, this is my response to it. Whether you're the loved one or it's yourself, right? When you have relapsed, you've picked up the drink or the drug, then what happens? So number two, using your compassionate mind. Think of possible responses and their consequences. Consider objectives, relationships, and expression in the short term and the long term. Because one of the things that is quite common that happens when people relapse is what's called the abstinence violation effect, which means that a person picks up the drink and or the drug, and then they feel so bad about what they've done that they think to themselves, well, I blew my sobriety, right? I just, I messed up, so I might as well make it worth my while, right? Or I might as well just keep drinking or just keep using because I've already screwed up, rather than being compassionate towards themselves. And I think that a lot of people do this personally. This is just a personal opinion, is that the reason why this happens is because they're going to get a lot. They know what's going to happen, right? They know that their family members, their loved ones are going to be judgmental, condemning. They're going to catch a lot of grief. That's a nice way to put it, right? So they figure, I might as well make this worth it, but there's going to be that thought process from some people, that perspective, well, but if I don't respond harshly, then my loved one won't get sober, right? I have to be angry and upset and yell and scream because that's the only way, like that's motivating my loved one. You do not have to get angry and upset and be critical and judgmental of your loved one for them to get sober. You just need to set healthy boundaries in a very loving and compassionate way. That is going to go much further than being angry and upset and yelling and screaming and condemning that person. So you want to use your compassionate mind, think of possible responses and their consequences, consider objectives, relationships, and expression in the short term and the long term. So I believe that by completing the first writing exercise and then completing this second exercise, you will start to strengthen that compassionate mindset, that neuro pathway, which is ultimately what the overall goal really is. All of these presentations in sum is so that you can start to learn these tools and ways of approaching the situations that you're experiencing with yourself and or your loved one when it comes to addiction in a way that is going to support recovery rather than relapse. And the only way things are going to change is if you yourself start to change your own responses to the way in which you have been approaching your problems. Again, based upon Wayne Dyer's quote of, if you change the way you look at things, the things you will look at change. So my version of that is, if you change the way you respond to things, the things you respond to have the potential to change. And I say have the potential because it's not guaranteed that the things that you're responding to will change, but the likelihood that they'll change if you change your response to them is much greater than if you continue to respond in the same old way, the same old pattern. So that's it for my 4-part series on compassion. I hope you found it valuable. If you did and you know someone else who may find this information beneficial, if you could please share the video with them as well. And thanks so much for you being here, and I hope you have a beautiful and a blessed day. See you in the next video.